This program is supported by grants from the Solon and Martha Dixon Foundation, the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935, and the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, State Lands Division.
Hi, I'm Doug Phillips, and this is another beautiful day along the Alabama Gulf Coast. It's just as beautiful as it ever was, but you know the story.
April 20th, 2010, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil well exploded, taking the lives of 11 men. 5,000 feet beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, oil began to spew into the marine ecosystem. In May, the first tar balls from the gushing undersea well reached Alabama's gleaming white sands.
Discovering Alabama is not a news program. We're a natural history program. And for us to now be bringing you such unhappy images from our Gulf Coast is our way of saying the Deepwater Horizon disaster has become something our state could be dealing with for years to come.
So many times we've shared the beauty of an Alabama surf. It saddens me to have to bring you these images from our fragile shores.
This is not a show that I ever wanted to have to do, but Discovering Alabama is your natural history program. If the consequences of this tragedy are going to be with us for a long time to come, let's explore the implications together.
This program is about a land unknown to many people. A land that in many ways has maintained its native natural wonders. A place of bountiful backcountry, forests, streams, and wildlife more diverse than can be found in much of the inhabited world. Come along with me as we explore the wild wonders of this land. Come along as we discover Alabama.
Welcome to Discovering Alabama. Since 1985, Discovering Alabama has been bringing you the magical wild wonders of our state. In many ways, the fascinating beauty and rich ecological treasures we've shared together have been our special secret.
Certainly the state has promoted Alabama as the place to be for outdoor recreation. And our soft, sun-soaked, sparkling sands have long been known as a prime vacation destination. But just beyond the restaurants, condos, and golf trails is a diversity of life that continues to amaze even those of us who explore the hidden places. What an irony that it took a man-made disaster to bring worldwide attention to the vital ecosystems along our coast. This travesty has provoked the ire of ardent environmentalists from across the globe.
It's an act of trespass, it's an act of theft, it's an act that if anybody else were doing it, it would be punished criminally. If a foreign enemy did this to our country, poison our beaches, poison the fishes, we would consider it an act of war.
It seems so much to be the fate of humans to only value things when they are about to or have already lost them. There's that saying, familiarity breeds contempt. And I think that we do take far too much for granted. And that it does sometimes take a catastrophe of this magnitude to remind us of just what we have to lose.
But isn't the Gulf oil spill yesterday's news? It's no longer on the front page. It's no longer at the top of the hour on every newscast.
The striking visuals of cleanup crews scrambling to protect our coastline are no longer around to attract the national media. You and I, though, don't have the luxury of packing up and heading off to the next big story. This is our home.
We've been discovering Alabama together for over 25 years. Wherever we go, we talk with local folk, inquire with knowledgeable experts, scientists, and we're used to getting answers. This time, it's different.
The oil is out there, it's in the system. What do we do now?
There's so many unknowns.
We don't know all of the impacts.
We don't know what will happen to the next year class.
Every day we don't know.
And we don't know how long that's going to be going on.
So we don't really know what is going to happen.
The thing we don't know about is really the long-term effects.
Science doesn't claim to have all the answers, but when every answer is, I don't know, it gets a bit frustrating.
That's actually a very important part of science, is sometimes admitting I don't know, now. And it's frustrating with this situation. We want answers immediately, we want results immediately, and that's not always the way science works. That's not the way the real world operates.
And that's the thing about science. It isn't quick, is it? There's a process. And so you don't get answers right away.
One thing we do know, though, these waters and wetlands that are threatened by the unknowns of the oil spill are what science calls critical habitat.
We have some special areas here that are very important, they're critical habitat, and they need protecting. And I might say that when you think about the top waters of the Gulf of Mexico on a sunlit summer day, it's just astounding to think of the life that's out there and the food web that's been established, and the necessity of all those organisms and how important they are to each other.
Well, we don't know all of the impacts of this spill yet on our habitats and wildlife, and that's one of the things that we're spending a lot of time doing in this area is coordinating research to look at exactly what those impacts are. And we want to make sure that we understand that fully so that we know how to restore the beaches and the marshes and all of these important wildlife habitats to the state that they once were in.
The thing we don't know about is really the long-term effects, okay? Because, for example, we're using the dispersant, and so this oil's still there, but the whole point is we did it so that we can't see it, all right? We can't see the oil. That doesn't mean it's having subtle effects, if not major effects, from an ecosystem standpoint. And those are things it's really going to take years to look at. And it's a new book that we're writing. I mean, we haven't ever had anything like this in the Gulf of Mexico to deal with. And so we're really going to have to take it step by step and try to evaluate what are the long-term repercussions of this type of oil spill, and one that has been addressed in this way, for example, with millions of gallons of dispersant.
As a scientific group down here, we have 12 full-time PhD scientists. We've been studying this part of the Gulf of Mexico since 1970. We have a large and long-term database. We know what lives offshore. We know what lives in the grass beds of Alabama. We know what lives on our oyster reefs and in the salt marshes. And that's well documented, so that if there's a change, we know what our potential loss might be.
If we did not have good baseline data, the unknowns would probably remain unknown. But being able to compare the data that we're collecting now, that has put us in an enormously powerful position as the reference station. The lab has been known nationally and internationally for its educational programs for many years. That was and remains kind of our foundation. But it's interesting because this catastrophe has really brought the research community to the fore. We've always had it, and now that there's a crisis, I think it's going to reveal and expose the research characteristics of the laboratory where they have not been even suspected before.
As scientists investigate the ramifications of oil in the Gulf ecosystem, oil invading our shores, they're confident that nature will provide them with answers. Eventually, it just might take some time.
There's so many unknowns associated with that, and that's why the focus has to stay strong on the Gulf of Mexico and all of these, all of the organisms that are impacted, but all the people that are impacted now and perhaps be impacted long into the future.
So really, before we truly understand the full extent and magnitude, it'll be a period of years. It'll likely be decades before we understand the full impact. But in terms of the restoration, implementation, and monitoring, we're looking at decades.
The long view remains that the system has the capacity to recover, and the unknowns is how long is it going to take, and is it going to be exactly the same when it comes back?
There are so many questions about what's normal, what's natural, what's the impact, and how does this change the future? And nobody can give you that answer. And it is frustrating for a journalist because you want facts. And it's also frustrating for the people who live off the resource.
I think that what we have to remember is that this is going to be a long battle ahead of us, and we can't give up and lose hope. And I think that it's going to be a long road ahead. I think we have to recognize that. We can't give up. I've met amazing people on the Gulf Coast, Alabama included, whose resiliency and determination is beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Today, the beach looks great, on the surface at least. What's going on beneath the sand?
For the most part, the highly visible evidence of the oil spill is no longer so apparent. But questions will remain that nature must answer. And as the old saying goes, time will tell.
Earlier, we talked about what a bitter irony that it took a man-made disaster to bring attention to Alabama's magnificent coast. There is perhaps another irony that is more poignant.
Focusing attention on critical Gulf habitat has made it strikingly obvious that the critters living within that habitat include us. When our coastal habitat was threatened, our coastal economy became endangered as the human critters deserted the summer sands. It will be months and years before the full impact of this oil spill on our wildlands and wildlife is fully understood.
One thing we know for sure right here, right now, this ecological disaster is an economic disaster for the residents of Alabama's Gulf Coast.
See, that's what's interesting, isn't it? That a lot of people around the country, I think that this is over, but I think for people who live on the coast, it's not over. There's still very many question marks. The businesses aren't back. The claims process isn't completely making everybody whole, as was promised from the beginning. And people are still suffering. One of the stories that I'm working on right now is the mental health fallout from having endured this event, and still the uncertainties of what it's going to do long term to the resources that people use, that people live from. And I had one pastor in Orange Beach described it for me, that the town was in a prolonged state of anticipated grief.
Lack of control is one of the most anxiety-provoking experiences for humans, regardless of the situation. And particularly in a situation where it's not a single disaster. It's not that the oil spilled, it was done, and now we move forward, but it's a combination of things. All of the unknowns just added up on one another, and when you do that to humans, when you place them in a position where they don't know what's coming next, it creates an unbelievable amount of fear and anxiety, and that's very hard to live with.
The nature of life is nature. You've heard me quote that axiom many times. And it's easy to understand. Our lives, the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, are all part of natural systems.
I think people here realize that their livelihoods are directly tied to the resources that are surrounding us, the natural resources, whether it be the beach or the estuaries and bays that are the places where all the sea life comes from.
The economics of this ecological disaster have far-reaching consequences for all of us across Alabama.
The devastating blow to the financial well-being of the seafood industry and the tourism industry ripples throughout our state in terms of lost tax revenues. And this at a time when the economy is already down. This at a time when our fiscal ability to take care of one another is already strained.
Some might say that an ardent nature lover like myself might find it difficult not to wag the finger a little bit.
Pointed right here, pointed at you, pointed at all of us. We've been using gas and oil like there was no tomorrow.
I think we have to remember that this is a symptom of a bigger problem. That this is a symptom of our dependence, our addiction to fossil fuels, to oil. And that as a nation, and certainly as a state in Alabama, all of us have a responsibility if we hate what's happening. And the truth is, not just because of an oil spill off the coast of Alabama or Louisiana and Mississippi out in the Gulf, it's because of our unwillingness and inability to understand that this country would be a stronger, better place without our dependence on fossil fuels.
Unfortunately, what you've heard, and I've usually told every group I've spoken to, that we're all guilty of criminal complacency. I think we trusted the industry beyond what we should have. Now, whether it was BP or Transocean or Halliburton or Anadarko, you know, it doesn't much matter. It's very difficult to wade through all of the bad things that were done wrong.
You know, there's a myth at the oil industry and their slick PR firms and their phony scientists, tobacco scientists, we call them biostitutes, and their phony think tanks on Capitol Hill have promoted, and their indentured servants in, the U.S. Capitol and state government have promoted that we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other, and that is a false choice. Good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community, like we're seeing here in the Gulf. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children.
We have to remember what brought this crisis on anyway, and I think that's our major addiction to oil. The drama and the tragedy and the fact that it was drawn out for so long, if there was any purpose or meaning for that, it was so that we would really be affected enough to wake up. And that's just where I feel.
We would be remiss if we didn't take time to reflect on the deep issues that led to this deepwater disaster. There's plenty of blame to go around. There are lessons to be learned. And just because we're not getting daily images of tar balls and cleanup crews, that does not mean we can pretend this tragedy is behind us. This is not a time to forget.
This is a time to remember the future, and to ask, what can we do together?
Come visit us. I mean, come down and see for yourself, walk on the beaches, and then be aware of, stay on top. I think we really need to stay on top of our lawmakers, and I think in terms of an energy policy, This is not just the Gulf Coast. This is right now our country. Alabama is one of the most unique, beautiful, bountiful places in the United States. So that's kind of, I want people to be aware of what's going on here, but this is not just about the Gulf Coast. This is about the impact on our country.
The fear is that we will repeat our behaviors. We are creatures of habit. That's what humans are. We gravitate towards what we know. We gravitate towards what's familiar, even if that is not adaptive and healthy in the long run. One of the most important things we can do in any sort of tragedy, trauma, disaster is to try in unique ways to keep it in front of people, showing them nuances of the experience, letting them learn whether it's positive or negative. And if you're able to do that, what happens is people adopt it at a much deeper level. When they're able to do that, then they're able to change their ways, and ultimately we're able to head for a much better future.
I really think that there is an opportunity here. It's always been a special place. It's been as productive today as it was 20 years ago and will be in the future, I hope. I think education is key, education and outreach to try to continue the message of how important our Gulf Coast area is, not only here in Alabama, but along the northern Gulf Coast from the panhandle of Florida all the way to Texas. So I'd like to think that maybe it's high time to recognize how we have utilized the resources in the Gulf of Mexico, and maybe it's time to give back a little bit and try to restore and give the ecosystem a boost.
I think the most important human role is helping the Gulf recover. And what the Gulf is going to need, and what the creatures of the Gulf are really going to need right now, is a place to come home to that is clean so that they can reproduce and thrive and grow. And we can recover from this spill and the effects of this spill as quickly as possible.
I think that it's important to remember just what's at stake. And when I look out here on the Five Rivers Delta, I mean, this is a national gift, a gift from nature that is here in the backyard of Mobile, Alabama. This is a treasure that every person in this state should be grateful for every day and should be proud that exists here and should come and see and visit and experience and love and protect. And not take for granted.
Uncertainties abound about economic recovery, about ecological recovery, about how to achieve the best energy future. But this much is certain: Alabama's Gulf Coast is a naturally wondrous part of the grand creation.
Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History, the University of Alabama. This program is supported by grants from the Solon and Martha Dixon Foundation, the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935, and the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, State Lands Division.